Hi, it's me. I'm actually alive and I still make these. I'm not dead just yet and I've done everything in my power to get this one out before Halloween.
You are too late. My blood now flows through your veins.
Who sleeps in the tombs of the dead by day and arises at night.
Good evening, monsters and mechanoids. Long time no see for this one. As many of you know, in my previous video on vampires and fictional works, I had intended to tackle the older, foundational works of vampire mythology. We discussed things like Carmilla, the vampire, and Dracula, but of course, I still missed some. I would like to acknowledge the commenter on my last vampire tier list video who made mention of Varney the Vampire. It's a bit of a long read, and I've been chipping away at it here and there in my free time while reading smaller books to contribute to this list. I'm hoping that I have more time to research with more vampire media so that I can cover the story in part 3, but I do have intentions to cover it, so don't worry. There's a lot that I've watched and read since I posted my last video, so I'll have a lot of other things to talk about in part 3 as well. To start off though, I wanted to talk about a book that I've read fairly recently, something I just happened to find in the store, and it ended up being perfect for this video. The book is simply titled Woman Eating by Claire Coda. This story was genuinely a very interesting and unique take on a vampire story. The main character herself, Lydia, is a vampire in the modern day, having been born from a vampire mother and turned by her as a baby due to having medical complications that would have otherwise resulted in her death. Instead of being your typical vampire story where the vampire is very powerful, wealthy, etc., this story turns that idea onto its head. From birth, Lydia's mother had instilled a lot of self-hatred, passing her feelings about herself and the nature of her existence down to her own daughter. She taught Lydia that they were demons, creatures despised by God, and that they needed to lead a life of isolation, teaching her how to fade away from friends and fear of being caught due to their inability to really age the same way that humans do. Lydia and her mother didn't prey on humans at all. Refusing to drink human blood, they live off of things like blood sausage, black pudding, and pig's blood, with Lydia herself having never eaten human food at all. Tired of these circumstances, seeking independence, and wanting to finally be able to live life on her own, Lydia eventually sent her mother away to live in a retirement home. Being an art school graduate with a great passion for her field of study, she opts to rent a studio space with other artists, hoping to finally live amongst humans and finally be able to feel human herself. Getting to know the other artists and having attended a dinner with them, Lydia's desire to be human was only amplified. But ultimately, living among humans wasn't what she thought it would be, experiencing things like having difficulties at her job, depression, loneliness, racism, with her being half Japanese, and sexism. Lydia only feels more alone than she's ever felt before. In many ways, she constantly fights who she is, struggling desperately to feel like an equal to those around her. It's a feeling that's definitely not isolated to just vampires, and one that a lot of us are very familiar with. I usually don't like the often half-assed inclusion of social media in books, but somehow this author's utilization of Instagram and YouTube surprisingly works, with Lydia often watching those what I eat in a day videos you often see trending these days, trying to experience eating real food vicariously through other people's experiences, especially food from her own culture, what her human father would eat before his passing. It doesn't feel clunky or out of place for once. It serves an overall purpose to the theme, and it feels genuinely sad at times. The other thing that I usually am personally not fond of, as I discussed before in the last video, are romance subplots. But much like some of the other vampire stories I'd praised before, this one executes it in a way where it actually feels like it fits into the story, at least for me. It works thematically, and I was actually invested in it. What really stuck with me is that there's this moment where she even seems to fall in love with one of the people in her workplace, but she herself can't distinguish whether she's feeling affection or suffering from her natural hunger for blood, given that she goes for a good while without even properly feeding herself. There's a point in this book where Lydia refuses to sustain herself off of any kind of blood in an attempt to feel more human, but this backfires when she attempts to eat human food and nearly dies from it. Throughout this entire book, you have instance after instance of Lydia desperate to feel human, to try and find some kind of place in this world, struggling constantly to just be a person and just to be treated like one. You also have these moments where it feels like the vampire character, the usual hunter, is actually victimized by just regular humans. One in particular being a man that is written in such an intimidating way, you'd think that he's the vampire. By the end of this book, every single attempt attempt to fit in with others and lead a normal life has failed. Despite meeting others that she cares for, no relationship actually feels close. Her job doesn't pan out, her romantic feelings towards her love interest Ben doesn't pan out. She's still equally as alone as before. Hopeless and driven to near madness from both hunger and hurt, she finally properly feeds as a vampire, killing and absorbing the life from the man who victimized and intimidated her, and in that way, tasting all the food he's ever eaten, finally having a taste of real human food. And for better or for worse, she's finally figured out who she is, what she's meant to do, and what her life will become from this point forward. While there are some spots that feel very slow in the book, I really didn't mind it too much, and the payoff, the ending, in my opinion, was very worth it. Some of the reception to this book surprised me, with some of the reviews I found saying that maybe the book could have gone more into things like the character's mixed race identity, but I personally disagree with that, and like how the allegory was executed. I'm not really an expert with these sort of things though, obviously, and my taste is usually pretty odd, as you know, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. I'm just a creature who really likes vampires. Overall, I'd say that Lydia's character is written very strongly. I enjoyed this book and learning about her, and really enjoyed the fact that instead of the vampire being treated as the real horror here, the world around them is. So I'll be placing Lydia and the story into the A tier. It's not the super ultra best execution of vampires ever made, but it doesn't have to be, and I recommend the book to more patient readers who don't mind a slow burn. And if you don't like slow burns, you really won't like this next one. This show is something that I've really loved for a long time. One that I feel doesn't really get as much coverage and is overall forgotten. I don't think I've included any anime so far in this list, so here's our first one for the weebs out there. Shiki. The plot of Shiki revolves around life in a small village, largely cut off from the rest of humanity, with life there generally being considered uneventful. Everything is going standard until one person passes away, then another. Villagers are being picked off one by one from an unknown cause. At first, this is attributed simply to some kind of epidemic by the village doctor, Dr. Ozaki. Given that he's in the medical field, he isn't exactly the most susceptible to superstition, and begins to investigate the cause. The primary symptom that everybody seems to experience before their sudden death is some kind of odd anemia, with other factors being quite confusing, like the ages of some of the deceased. The most confusing being one of the first among the dead, Megumi Shimizu, who only died at 16 years old. Other confusing factors begin to crop up as well, as victims tend to isolate themselves fully from society by resigning from their jobs and even moving before their death. Not everybody is taking a rational medical approach to this, however, with some in the village being more superstitious. Some are also rightfully being skeptical of these new neighbors who have just moved in, being sparsely seen and living in an oddly ornate entire castle. This castle belongs to the Kirishiki family, an odd bunch who, as I said before, keeps to themselves and aren't generally seen out in public, and when they are, they definitely act pretty strangely.
Who are you?
You're a fiction writer.
Huh?
The youngest family member, at least in appearance, is Sunako Kirishiki, who seems to oddly have a great understanding of the world when encountered by one of the village's junior monks. This monk, Seishin Muroi, and Dr. Ozaki combine their usually clashing perspectives of the supernatural versus a more scientific approach, and gradually come to an understanding of what's going on, that these vampires, these creatures that they refer to as Shiki, are slowly and strategically conquering the village, killing and turning all those who live in it. But upon the discovery and first killings of these vampires, that's where Muroi's and Ozaki's perspectives deviate once more, with Muroi sympathizing more with the perspective of the Shiki, and Ozaki, along with almost the rest of the village, taking a more survivalist perspective and seeking to cull the Shiki before it's too late. And that's what I found myself personally liking about the show. It explores a lot of surprisingly morally gray areas in a show about an otherwise potentially terrifying monster, with the Shiki just wanting to be able to live normally, having a spot so that they can roam around peacefully with those they love, and the humans, well, wanting to retain the exact same thing for themselves and their families. The Shiki, much like the humans, are still sentient, are still capable of loving each other, and still retain their memories of their past lives and past loved ones. Not just their memories either, but also often their past feelings for the people they care about. They're still very much themselves, but now they have to drink blood, live exclusively under the light of the moon, have to be invited into homes to be able to physically enter, and so on. The villagers who didn't turn and flat out died from the anemia weren't necessarily deliberate casualties, with some of the Shiki even upset that they they couldn't even give their loved ones the same immortality that they'd obtained for themselves. The humans, obviously, are also rightfully afraid, with some of their own loved ones also being taken from them in this conflict and their once safe home being taken from them. You'll see both sides resulting to endless, unnecessary brutality. Families and friends turning against each other. Humans deliberately leaving vampires, the people they once knew and grew up with, out in the sun to boil and bake. Just watching them scream and their skin pop until they become little more than ash, taken from both conventional life and the eternal. You see vampires drain the people they once knew, only for them to never rise back up from the dead as they'd wanted. You'll see husband and wife turn on each other, siblings, parents and children, everybody. A village that once cared for each other despite all of the trivial annoyances and gossip is now torn apart. There's only one tragic way for this story to end, and that's with the village largely dead at the hands of both sides. Families are presumably unable to even reunite in an afterlife, as the entire village is burned to the ground, leaving few survivors. While many don't like Shiki's slow pace, I found myself enjoying the show quite a bit, with its great themes and its tragic ending resonating with me. The deaths are tragic and brutal, the characters on either side are oddly sympathetic. The soundtrack for the show also deserves acknowledgement, as it's absolutely amazing, and only amplifies the sense of tragedy and emotion in these scenes. That's excluding the opening that's done by Bucktick, who I'm obviously a huge fan of. Sure, you get a lot of the odd anime-isms with it, like the funny wacky hair and the humans somehow not noticing the freaky eyes on these pale-ass vampires, but once you can get past all that, in my opinion, it's a great show. Sunako, along with some of the other characters in the show, are some of my favorite vampire characters of all time, and while I know this certainly isn't a show for everybody, it definitely is for me. So, given my attachment to the characters, the theme, the amazing soundtrack, and the story, I'll be ranking this one and its characters in the S tier. Sure, it's not Dracula, but does every single piece of vampire media have to be? Listen, you can bully me for it, but if people can love Twilight, then I'm allowed to love Shiki. You can give me this one. So now, with 2 slow burn stories under our belt for this video, let's move on to something more fast-paced, the Blade series. I'm going to be ranking all 3 of these movies in succession to each other, and boy, do I have opinions on that third one. But for now, let's start with the first movie. Blade, very obviously, revolves around its protagonist of the same name. Blade is a Dhampir, meaning he's largely still human with the advantages that come with being a vampire. He doesn't have to shelter himself from the sun or anything like that, but he still does have to consume the blood of the living. As a quick side note, Dhampirs as a concept in and of themselves are very fascinating and are seen in plenty of other media, which will be discussed later in this series. Can you tell that I'm excited to talk about Vampire Hunter D? Anyways, Blade is a Dhampir that hunts vampires. The story starts off pretty solidly, in fact, by showing him raiding a nightclub full of vampires who cleverly activate and then dance and feed gluttonously under a bunch of sprinklers that were filled with blood rather than water. It's so silly, but I honestly liked the idea and it definitely got my attention. After the fight that ensues, one of the vampires is captured by the police and is taken to receive treatment at a hospital. This predictably doesn't go over very well, with the vampire attacking and biting one of the staff that works there, a woman named Karen Jensen. Thankfully, she survives this encounter, being saved by Blade, who takes him to his friend Abraham Whistler. Whistler treats her wounds and patches her up, but unfortunately they're unable to help her fully, as Karen is now marked and can be tracked down by the vampire who bit her. Along with this information, a lot of the world we're witnessing is further elaborated on. Whistler and Blade as a pair have been fighting against these vampires, cleverly using these devices and weapons that utilize the typical weaknesses of vampires. Think things like garlic and sunlight. It's honestly such a cool and goofy concept to me. Everything about this movie is honestly so fun. There are other interesting sci-fi elements as well, such as Blade using experimental serums to keep his vampiric hunger at bay, while still having all the abilities associated with being a Dhampir that make combat easy for him. This is arguably the only thing that's keeping the remainder of his humanity intact. But to get back to the main story, since Karen has unfortunately been marked by the vampire who bit her, Whistler and Blade instruct her to leave the city before it's too late. But it already kinda is, as upon returning to her apartment, she's attacked by a police officer who works with the vampires. This is this movie's interpretation of the vampire's familiar, which is so goofy, but it's a really witty parallel to the idea that there's some corruption in the police force, and that they work for the interests of those above them. Vampires have often, since their beginnings, been used to be an allegory of a parasitic, wealthy nobility that pulls the strings. It's really interesting to see a modern context that actually expands upon this, especially in what's otherwise your typical fun, endearingly cheesy 90s action movie. Anyways, once again, Karen is saved in the nick of time by Blade, who interrogates the familiar and learns of the existence of these remaining pages from something called the Vampire Bible. That's That's actually what it's called. Don't worry about it. Whilst this is going on, you have a bunch of spooky vampire villains plotting. They're introduced as a council of vampire elders, and they're not really the evil monolith you'd think that they'd be. There's some infighting going on within the vampires. As the host of the party shown earlier, Deacon Frost, speaks on behalf of the younger generation of vampires. Frost isn't really taken seriously by the rest of the Elder Council, seeing as he's not a typical natural-born vampire and is therefore considered impure. Presumably partly to prove himself and his power, he intends to wage a war between vampires and humans, to which the elders disagree. This disagreement results in Frost having one of the elders killed, the rest swiftly taken out of power. We later learn from this really odd scene that Frost, power-hungry and driven by little more than his ego, seeks to complete a ritual, in which 12 purebloods must be sacrificed in order to awaken the blood god. Even worse still, the ritual requires Blade's blood as well. Everything else in the movie goes on as you would figure, with Blade obviously wanting to prevent this from happening, Karen assisting him, and many cool fight scenes happening during this. There's a lot of other little predicaments that pop up in this movie and other fun plot twists along the way, but I only really want to set up the context and universe for the Blade trilogy enough for you to understand what kind of movies these are. The only remaining information that I feel is essential is that at some point Blade's only lifeline to his own humanity is put at risk. We find that he's developing a tolerance to the serum that he's using, and that it's not going to work for much longer. Karen, being a hematologist, begins experimenting to find an alternative for Blade. She begins experimenting with something called EDTA, which doesn't seem to mesh very well with the blood of a vampire. In fact, the combination of the two literally causes an explosion. Probably not very good for whoever it's injected into. Unfortunately, no effective cure for Blade is found. However, thankfully, the EDTA ends up proving vital in killing Frost once the ritual starts. Yes, Frost literally explodes, and it's one of the silliest things I've seen happen to a vampire in a movie. After all is said and done, Karen is still determined to cure Blade, but he instead, being only more motivated now by the events prior, asks her only to improve the serum, wanting to retain his advantageous strength as a Dhampir, and use it to continue ridding the world of vampires, ultimately sacrificing a part of his humanity for the greater good. Personally, I like a good semi-cheesy movie that's dated in an endearing way, and Blade does deliver on that front. I generally don't expect too much from this kind of movie other than a good enough plot and really cool action scenes, but I really liked this one, and I love some of the pretty creative approaches that this first movie takes with vampire mythology. I was pleasantly surprised to see that even vampire media that I'd have thought to be more on the simple side would still have some degree of social commentary, and a surprisingly strong enough theme to go along with it. You guys may tire of this rank being used repeatedly so far in this video, but I feel that the first Blade movie also goes into the A tier, which, given some of the other stuff that I had to watch for the series, I choose to be grateful for. Whether the rest of the Blade movies hold up, we'll have to see. In Blade 2, if you thought that the vampires were already bad enough, vampires begin to be infected with some sort of virus, turning them into something much more monstrous called a Reaper. Blade has to fight alongside a band of vampires that he would otherwise consider to be his enemies. That, alongside dealing with a presumed dead Whistler being found, new faces and new betrayals, and a noticeably absent Karen with a new character, Nissa, taking her role for a good part of the movie. Don't get too attached to her either, though. She's not staying. Other than the fact that I personally miss Karen, this movie was also really good, and I feel that it adequately expands on the already existing story without feeling unnecessary. The movie still feels fun, Blade is still an amazing and memorable character, and the sequel still retains that endearing cheesiness that I mentioned liking before. Some criticisms of the sequel discuss a lack of character development, which is absolutely fair in my opinion, but to be honest, for something like Blade's character, I didn't really go in expecting too much of that. It's Blade. The villain we later discover is an interesting little freak, as well as the other vampires that Blade gets partnered with, despite otherwise being enemies. Despite easily being able to tell that these guys aren't going to stay and survive for very long, the plot with them is fun. You can disagree with me, but I'm not expecting peak high-class cinema from the Blade movies. You're allowed a bit of senseless action as a treat once in a while. Not every vampire story has to be this great poetic gothic take of doomed romance and loss. Sometimes you get cool protagonists with guns and swords, and that's okay. So, like it or not, this gets the same ranking as the first movie for me. Now, I'm going to be upfront and honest with you. The third movie does not get this treatment from me. Not in any capacity. I'm going to be very straight with you guys. Blade 3, like Twilight, was a movie that I could absolutely not finish. I did not like what I watched, and I couldn't continue. If any of you actually liked Blade 3, I'm very happy for you, but I personally did not enjoy it at all. See, the plot centers around something that doesn't make very much sense to me to begin with. Blade is framed by a group of vampires in order to invoke the attention of law enforcement on him. I don't want to sound like a CinemaSins video by any means, but my suspension of disbelief can only go so far. As I mentioned before, the vampires in the first movie already had ties to law enforcement. They have their familiars straight up working for them as police officers. Blade has already fought law enforcement before, and was basically impervious to them. The first two movies established that Blade is an absolute death machine that the law simply just couldn't touch. He's literally only ever struggled against total monsters, complete abominations, and he still won. How is it that the FBI being sent after him is only an issue now? But you know me, I try my hardest to be fair. I kept watching, hoping by the end of the movie, maybe despite this large inconsistency, I'd still like it. But it's when law enforcement catches up to him, kills Whistler after all of his near-death experiences that he's already had, and then takes him into custody for interrogation, that I started losing my patience. The interrogation scene is a boring slog that feels like it takes forever. The idea of Blade finally not being this ultra-powerful character and having moments of weakness is in itself an amazing prospect. Him experiencing a real loss is a great idea too. But the way that this movie does it is excruciating. It feels like we're stuck in this scene for ages and that nothing is happening. Already disappointed with the general plot of the movie so far and genuinely bored of the scene in front of me, I decided to pause the movie and read the rest of the synopsis, determining that it wasn't worth it and shutting the movie off disappointed. I always try to form my own opinions on media. I don't just go with critics' pre-existing criticisms of a film or a novel. You can see this happening where I disagree with some of their critiques pertaining to both woman eating and Shiki. Hell, I even played devil's advocate for the earlier movies in the same series. But unfortunately, I found myself agreeing with a lot of the poor critical reception to this movie. From what I did read, and clips that I had watched in isolation, they had a lot of interesting ideas for this movie, but they fell flat due to a weak story and desire to rehash themes that were already well traversed in the first two. You can only watch Blade Does the Thing Again so many times, and it's criminal given the great potential that he has as a character. While I did say that I wasn't necessarily watching Blade movies for peak character development, that doesn't mean I want you to pluck his brain out and put him onto a carousel, making him explore the same circular path over and over. Let him live! Let him free! I really hate to be mean to a series that I otherwise absolutely loved, but this whole third movie is pointless. It doesn't exist to me. So I'm putting Blade 3 far below its predecessors in the D tier. Again, if you enjoyed it personally, because I know some people do, I'm really happy that you did. I just couldn't do it. Personally, I didn't find watching it or researching it enjoyable, but it should go without saying that I'm not an arbiter of all opinion. Now, I've heard that a reboot for Blade is in the works, and regardless of how I feel about the third movie, I hope this new project goes well and finds similar, if not better, success than the first two movies. If it does come out, you can be certain that I'll be giving it a watch. And one last thing on this subject, please don't ever let my opinions dissuade you. I encourage you to pick up any of this media for yourself and give it a try. You might like something a lot more than I did. So, with the Blade movies covered, I'd like to cover one more piece of media for this video. There's a lot more that I definitely want to discuss for later parts, and don't you worry, I've already watched Morbius. I'm getting to it. Just after having to bash on Blade 3, I figure we'll need something more positive to close this out with. Let's end this on a good note and not a trashy one. And there's many pieces of vampire media that I absolutely love already, though I've already discussed a Dampier in this video and the declining quality of the movies he's in. I wanted to discuss another Dampier character that I'm a huge fan of. Yes, we're finally talking about Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust. I aim to discuss his other adventures perhaps in another video, but this specific movie is, so far, my favorite take on a Dampier character. Our Dampier character, simply named D, is a vampire hunter for hire who takes on a bounty to retrieve a girl named Charlotte Elborn, who is supposedly taken in the night by vampire nobleman Baron Meyer Link. There's only one problem though. The bounty is contested. D was not the only one hired to retrieve Charlotte. By the time D sets on his way to find her, an entire group of vampire hunters is already on the hunt. Whoever gets her first gets the rest of the cut. As the story unfolds, we eventually learn that Charlotte left by her own will, that her and Meyer had genuinely fallen in love with each other, but also that there's a more nefarious hand taking advantage of their affection and their desire to escape their circumstances. Suspiciously and supposedly out of the goodness of her heart, Countess Carmilla Elizabeth Bathory herself has promised to assist the couple in their escape, promising them sanctuary in the City of the Night, only for it to be revealed that she intends to feed on the blood of Charlotte, which would restore her powers. And I have to point this out. The way that they were supposed to be being sent on their way by Carmilla to the City of the Night is genuinely so crazy and so cool. I don't think I've ever seen what's basically a gothic vampire spaceship before. Now, I have to point out, even on the more spoilery side of things, which I will warn you about one final time if you want to experience this movie for yourself, which I heavily recommend you do, is that many of the characters you see throughout this movie don't survive, with all but one of the group of bounty hunters, that being Layla, dying in the pursuit of pride and money. Much like they themselves are unlucky enough to learn, while I obviously wasn't the most invested in them at the beginning, by the end you realize that the strong bonds and promise that they had shared were ended along with their lives, all for the chance of earning coin. It surprised me how sad I was to see Grove die in order to save Layla, as I went in only expecting just another group of disposable goofballs for the protagonist to face, which I guess to an extent they were, but there was also more to them than just that. This recurring theme of loss driven by human desires also extends to the couple, with Charlotte having been drained of her blood by Carmilla, tragically dying for nothing. Everyone, alive or dead, save for Dee, gambled and lost everything they had, only to come out of it with nothing. A group that was arguably family gone, with no trace save one person to tell the tale. A couple forever separated, and an evil woman who sought only for power just removed from the plane of existence by Dee. Except for Dee, everyone played and lost. And even Dee himself, normally stoic and unshaken, clearly feels the impact of this by the end, taking pity on the vampire nobleman that he had been chasing the whole time, and fought, sparing his life. Even as Dee and Layla are able to walk away with their lives intact, and with enough proof to earn the money they had been fighting for, you're left to wonder, was all of this worth it? Well, I mean, that's the impact that it had on me anyway. I don't know about you could have interpreted this entirely differently from how I did. You can have so many different takeaways from the same movie, but the ending of the movie did resonate with me for that reason, and yes, we definitely have to talk about the art style. It's absolutely gorgeous. This movie genuinely has some of the best art I've ever seen in animation. The character designs themselves are so cool and the environments are so amazing. I love Carmilla's design. It's so weird and almost alien, much like the environment that she occupies in the movie, but it's so cool. This movie is genuinely one of my favorites on the entire list by far. It'd be crazy not to put it in the S tier. And I can easily say that I'm very eager to finish the Vampire Hunter D novel that I was fortunate enough to get my hands on. I'll definitely be covering it in another one of these videos once I do. For now though, I feel that I've covered plenty enough to discuss. I hope you enjoyed hearing my input on these stories, and I hope that you will join me next time when I talk about even more wonderful pieces involving one of my favorite kinds of fictional creatures. I hope you have an absolutely wonderful Halloween, and thank you so much for watching. If you liked my discussion on this topic and you want to see more in the future, feel free to subscribe. Despite meeting others that she cares for,